The concierge told me that the Heffron house was built at the turn of the 20th century, back when Galveston was known as the Wall Street of the West. The city's strategic position in the Gulf of Mexico made it a powerhouse in the export of cotton. Preposterous amounts of money flowed in with the riptide, as did European immigrants looking for their share of the American dream. Isaac Heffron, a Welsh cement contractor who would find his fortune in establishing Galveston's waterworks and sewage system, was just one of the many emigres to deposit influences of his homeland on the island. The result is a pastiche of Gilded Age architecture, most of which skews Victorian, relics of a time when Galveston was the third richest city in the United States. Today, the Heffron house is a bed and breakfast. I checked in around 3. A bad storm was expected to roll through within the hour, but it held out long enough for the concierge and I to continue our conversation on the porch. An East Texas native, my host had moved to Galveston 10 years prior, scoring a job with the town's historic commission not long afterwards. I'd spent most of the morning wandering the city streets, so I had plenty to ask him about. When I brought up the hurricane, he pointed to a star nailed on the front entrance. On September 8, 1900, the Galveston Daily News made a passing reference in its final pages to a hurricane in the Gulf. Cuban meteorologists were signaling alarms that the storm was on a direct path to Texas, but there was a sentiment in the States at the time that their Caribbean colleagues were sensationalist, and that it was best not to provoke unnecessary panic. Besides, residents of the Gulf were no strangers to powerful storms. When the gales came in on a blackened horizon, many Galvestonians reportedly lined the beach to watch the spectacle unfold. This complacency would prove fatal, as the 1900 Galveston hurricane would go down as the deadliest natural disaster in North American history. Dr. Isaac Monroe Klein, Galveston's resident climatologist, was the first to become aware of the storm's magnitude. Later in life, he would claim that he and his brother canvassed every home within 3 blocks of his house, urging everyone they could to reach higher ground. His detractors denounced this as pure mythology. Klein, after all, wrote in the Daily News 9 years prior that Galveston's shallow waters made it virtually immune to hurricane devastation. What we do know is that, upon landfall, he opened his doors to over 50 residents seeking refuge from the storm, confident his Victorian home could withstand the winds. When it collapsed, only Klein, his brother, and his children survived. His wife and their unborn baby were among the victims. Similar stories resonated across town. Hundreds were crushed to death when Sacred Heart Church collapsed, and 90 children drowned when a wave destroyed St. Mary's Orphanage. My host told me that the Heffron house was one of the luckier improvised shelters, sustaining only minor damages to the roof and a few broken windows. The purported 200 refugees that crammed inside all survived. He then pointed to a dilapidated mansion down the street, claiming that a similar miracle unfolded inside of its once ornate halls. The more modest homes on the block were almost unequivocally obliterated. Some mansions, like the Heffron house, would become temporary boarding homes for survivors, while others, like Mayfield Manor downtown, would be retrofitted into makeshift morgues. Our conversation was coming to an end. The concierge suggested that I check out the Rosenberg Library on Sealy Avenue, mentioning that the 4th floor housed a museum dedicated to the hurricane. As you walk in, you pass a wall memorializing the names of 2,000 victims. A panel inside told me that the Daily News published a list of over 4,000 names in October of 1900, but that many of the victims were never identified. Estimates range between 6,000 and 12,000 lives lost, with the most credible reports being closer to 8,000. At the time, Galveston accounted for just over 37,000 inhabitants, which means a fifth of the population was gone overnight, almost the equivalent of 3 9/11s. It's the kind of scale that almost numbs your ability to feel it. Then you see the pictures.
My brother and I stood on a mattress all night long with the water up to here, up to here, and holding my head up like this to keep out of that water going down.
No less than 70 bodies a day were found throughout the month of September. Martial law went into effect, and posses of survivors, most of whom were black, were forced at gunpoint to round up the dead. The smell of bloated corpses was so intolerable that many improvised mass saturated with camphor. Others gorged the whiskey they received as payment to numb their senses. One panel struck me so much that I feel compelled to read it verbatim. On September 10th, 2 days after landfall, survivors loaded 700 bodies onto barges and took them out to sea, where they waited and dropped them overboard. Many bodies floated back ashore. The Central Relief Committee then decided to burn the bodies in funeral pyres. As a result, human ash fell from the sky. These fires burned well into November 1900. Attempts to identify bodies ended, but jewelry and personal items were removed for later identification. The adjoining room was an exhibit dedicated to a general history of Galveston. It's here where I first encountered Dr. Klein and his disputed tales of heroism. Jean Lafitte, the pirate whose colony laid the foundations for a city to come. In a curious watercolor that seemed all too familiar. Galveston would never recover its former glory. The 20th century saw the Wall Street of the West transform into a maritime Vegas, the once prominent island becoming a refuge for gamblers, bootleggers, and prostitutes. Providentially, this economic downturn staved off remodeling efforts, keeping, as one book says, the wrecking balls at bay and allowing this treasure trove of Victorian architecture to escape urban renewal. In her foreword to that same book, Cynthia Marshall writes that the Galveston that was is becoming the Galveston that is, and I can think of no better way of putting it. For as much of its history remains in the foreground, so much more radiates in absence, like the salt in the air that eats away the pain of ruined mansions. These mute obelisks bear silent testimony to an annihilated world. Come in the eerie quiet of the off-season, and maybe you'll hear a whisper in the wind, but it's only a trace. Everything else went up in smoke when 8,000 stories rained down on the Gulf of Mexico before being swept beyond the horizon by the riptide.